Welcome to our mini lecture for Southeast Asia this week. As we turn to the southeastern part of the continent, southward from East Asia, of course, down into Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, over 1,000 different islands. Truly fascinating part of the world. Aside from physical commonalities, peninsula and island countries of Southeast Asia share a deep cultural past, related but not separate from the cultures of Southwest China. All except Thailand share recent experiences with European colonialism, as we'll see a map of later on. Landforms, the mainland region of the Eurasian continent, has a vast complex series of islands arranged in chains and groups, related to its tectonic origin. Tectonic plates, that is, referring to Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam occupy the Indochina Peninsula, as it's known, and the archipelago, or a series of small islands, large and small islands, that is, grouped into countries of Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Timor-Leste, or East Timor, and the Philippines. We can think of Alaska also having an archipelago, other archipelagos around the world as well. Indonesia has some 17,000 islands, much more than the 1,000 I quoted just 2 slides ago, and Philippines over 7,000. It's a staggering amount of diverse islands. Irregular shapes and landforms of the Southeast Asian mainland and archipelago result of tectonic forces unleashed when India split from the African plate and collided with the Eurasia plate. Also contributing to the formation of the Himalayan mountains. Deforestation, a very significant environmental problem in Southeast Asia, which contains only 5% of the world's forest, but in the last 10 years accounted for 25% of the deforestation globally. We hear a lot about the tropical rainforest in Africa and South America, but actually Indonesia and Malaysia hold vast stores of tropical rainforest as well. Very important tropical rainforest, although quickly being deforested. Deforestation in Southeast Asian countries amounts to billions of dollars per year in lost ecosystem services. Ecosystem services refers to renewable food, construction, fuel resources, rainwater capture and purification, flood amelioration, biodiversity preservation, many other services as well from ecosystems that we all rely upon. So the very significant issue here being oil palm plantations. It's used as a cooking oil, food products, soap and cosmetics, machine oil. You'd be hard-pressed not to find it in some of your household products currently. However, hopefully some of you are aware of the implications of palm oil and are trying to avoid it in your products. It's causing its production is causing the deforestation of Indonesian, Malaysian rainforest. They're the world's largest palm oil producers, resulting in extensive deforestation. Smoke from burning forest and peat periodically covers much of the region, reducing air quality. If a peat swamp is cleared for oil palm plantation, more carbon is released through the burning of subsurface peat than the centuries of CO2 absorption by growing palm oils can counteract. So very significant effects on global warming through increased carbon dioxide emissions. Shifting cultivation is important to mention here. Sometimes referred to as slash and burn or swidden cultivation. It's been practiced sustainably for thousands of years in the hills of uplands of mainland Southeast Asia and parts of the islands, southwestern China as well. Where population densities are relatively low, the farmers can practice this sustainable shifting cultivation indefinitely, but to allow for long fallow periods or dormant periods where they let the vegetation regrow after it's been burned and cultivated, a lot of times in 5 to 7 year cycles. The system requires larger areas than other types of agriculture, and sometimes it's getting a bad rap currently because it accounts for a significant portion of the region's deforestation with the burning clearing forest, and can result in wildfires. Climate change and water, very important to consider in this region, as mainland Southeast Asia's largest rivers, the Irrawaddy, the Salween, the Mekong, Red River, they're fed during the dry season, November to March, by the glaciers in the Himalayas, and these are now melting at a rate that could result in eventual disappearance, as well as dams upriver and in China in particular, blocking access to seasonal water downriver in Southeast Asia. As glacial melting accelerates, the immediate risk is catastrophic flooding. So long-term concern is reduced dry season flows in rivers where glacier melt water is the primary source of flow. And significantly, 15% of the region's rice depends on the dry season flows of major rivers. Also important to keep in mind is coral reef bleaching. Global climate change is expected to increase sea temps in Southeast Asia, threatening coral reefs that sustain much of the region's fishing and tourism, already beginning to happen at alarming rates. As rising water temperatures are related to climate change, as well as ocean acidification, becoming more acidic, that is, from the absorption of excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, both of these processes cause bleaching. Many fish caught in Southeast Asia depend on healthy coral reefs for survival, and thousands of communities depend on that fish for food, or therefore threatened by coral reef bleaching. The peopling of Southeast Asia, or the migrations that brought them there. Indigenous populations of Southeast Asia rose from two migrations widely separated in time. The first over 40,000 years ago, and the second from 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, as the people of southern China began moving southward. About 5,000 years ago, skilled farmers and seafarers from South China migrated to what's now Taiwan, then Philippines, the island of Southeast Asia, and Malay Peninsula as well. And therefore, we can see very diverse cultural influences across the region. Overland trade routes surrounding the seas brought traders, religious teachers, even invading armies from China and India, as well as Arab armies from Southwest Asia. The newcomers brought religion, trade goods, religions such as Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, trade goods, food plants deep into Indonesia and Philippine archipelagos and throughout the mainland. Monsoon winds facilitated access for merchant ships from South Asia and the Persian Gulf even. Spatial patterns of religion in Southeast Asia reveal island mainland division that reflects the influences from the waves of India, China, Southwest Asia, and Europe even. Religious legacies. Hinduism and Buddhism arrived thousands of years ago via the monks and traders. Many early Southeast Asian kingdoms and empires switched back and forth between Hinduism and Buddhism as the official religion. Today, Buddhism dominates mainland Southeast Asia, while Hinduism remains the dominant only on the Indonesian islands of Bali and Lombok. In Vietnam, people practice a mix of Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism. This reflects the thousands of years when Vietnam was parts of various Chinese empires. And continuing more presently as well, Islam now dominant in the islands of Southeast Asia. Islam came mainly through South Asia after India was conquered by Mughals in the 15th century. And Muslim spiritual leaders and traders converted formerly Hindu Buddhist kingdoms of Indonesia, Malaysia, parts of southern Philippines, where Islam is still dominant in these regions. And then Roman Catholicism was a predominant region in East Timor and most of Philippines as they were colonized by Portugal and Spain respectively. So on that globalization and development front, we can see previous colonies of European nations in the Southeast Asian region, Britain, France, the US, Dutch, and Portugal mainly. The state aid and export-led economic development in the 1960s through 90s Its national governments in Southeast Asia created strong, sustained economic expansion by emulating two strategies pioneered by Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea: the state-aided market economies, and then also the export-led economic development, focusing on investment in industries that manufacture products, particularly for export, primarily to developed countries. The standards of living increased markedly, especially in Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand, and were facilitated as well by export processing zones, or EPZs. Since the 1970s, EPZs have expanded economic development in the region. And what's interesting to note as well is that 80 to 90% of the workers are women. So you see a very strong feminization of the labor force. And employers prefer to hire young single women because they are perceived as the cheapest and least troublesome employees. Working conditions: not unusual for assembly line employees to work 10 to 12-hour days, 7 days a week. So very tough conditions. Labor unions are frequently repressed by the governments. Growth of the service sector is improving working conditions and driving up pay, fortunately, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And we can also look at the regional integration. The ASEAN Association of Southeast Asian Nations, created to increase trade between all 10 Southeast Asian nations, started in 1967 as an anti-communist, anti-China association, but focuses on agreements that strengthen regional cooperation, including agreements with China. There's a free trade agreement now in place, and by 2010, total interregional trade amongst the ASEAN nations was more than trade with any one outside country or region. So this represents a strong regional association. And here we have a map of the total exports to other countries around the world. It's a very significant trading bloc. And on the power and politics note, coming out of such strong economic might, we can also look at a history of the violent conflict in the region. In particular, the repressive military regime in Burma that thwarted open elections and pro-democracy demonstrations for more than 20 years. Began to allow small changes in 2012. Thailand dealing with deep divisions between supporters of royalist military and large populist movement. And Philippines as well, plagued with long line of dictators. Now elected governments have resolved many of the problems, but militant Muslims in southern islands continue the insurgency. So let's look at a map here. Obviously, some of the large expanse of Indonesia, showing multiple bouts of conflict. Cambodia as well, brutal history there in the 1970s with the Khmer Rouge massacres. And on to urbanization. Very significantly throughout Southeast Asia, employment in agriculture has been declining as new production methods take over, introduced labor-saving equipment, continuation of the Green Revolution we were talking about in South and East Asia, both those regions. Now many family farmers sold land to prosperous local farmers or agribusiness corporations, and cities like Jakarta, Manila, and Bangkok in Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand respectively, for those three, are what's known as primate cities. Cities that with their suburbs are vastly larger than all the other cities in the country. To take a look at population and gender theme as well, women now constitute 50% of the 8 million immigrants from Southeast Asia. So immigrants, people leaving the region. In particular here going to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, to India and Japan, South Korea as well. We can see the migrations. About 3 million people participate in the global quote-unquote maid trade. Most are educated women from the Philippines and Indonesia who work under 2 to 4 year contracts in wealthy homes throughout Asia and other parts of the world as well. And unfortunately, the HIV/AIDS issues throughout the region are very severe. It's a significant public health issue, And however, we can see some improvements and rates declining in recent years. We can only hope that that continues. Elsewhere in the region, HIV rates are expected to increase in rural areas, though. Secondary cities where conservative religious leaders and faith-based international agencies restrict sex education and AIDS prevention programs, such as the promotion of condom use. So this is a very serious issue in HIV spreading areas, and one that's very complicated by, as we say here, conservative religious leaders and faith-based international agencies. And so religious and cultural pluralism is important to keep in mind. The region being a mainstay of cultural pluralism, inhabited by groups of people from many different backgrounds over the past 40,000 years, from lots of different places from the previous regions we've looked at in the last couple weeks. Patterns of religious practice are complex. They reveal the patterns of distribution across the island mainland divisions. So just to end on this fascinating map of some of the major religions across the region, showing the effects of many different migrations, including European colonialism and even more modern movements from mainland China into some of these areas. Thanks, and look forward to your questions and our discussions down below.